What are drag-along rights or drag-along provisions? Well, these are protective provisions applicable to preferred shares or to a company issuing preferred shares as part of an investment transaction. The drag-along rights allow the company generally to force minority shareholders to go along with an intended transaction, generally the sale of all or a substantial portion of interest in the company. So it prohibits a group of minority shareholders or a group of preferred shareholders from holding up an intended transaction that will benefit the company. Now, these provisions generally state that if a minimum number of preferred shares or common shares approve a specific transaction, then the minority group that does not want or does not approve that transaction cannot hold up the transaction. Now, when you're establishing these, you're going to set a minimum threshold within common shares and preferred shares. So you'll set a minimum threshold across all shares. What is the minimum number of shareholders who must vote to approve a transaction before these drag-along provisions kick in, where you can drag along the minority shareholders? And within any class, what is the minimum number or minimum threshold of preferred shareholders in any given class of ownership that must approve the transaction before the other members can be dragged along? Oftentimes in the classes, it may not be majority approval, but overall, total number of shares approving a transaction, it generally must be at a minimum a majority number or supermajority, depending on whatever is established in the bylaws or in these rights agreements. And then you oftentimes establish a minimum price per share or minimum total valuation before these drag-along rights kick in. That is, a majority of shareholders cannot force the sale of the company despite minority shareholders disagreeing, unless the company is valued at a certain price or you get a certain price per share. And this is, once again, to keep a company from preemptively selling before it's reached its maturity value. So you set that minimum price, and if you do get that minimum price per share, that minimum total value, then once again, the larger class of shareholders can drag along the minority shareholders to make them go along with the deal, to keep them from holding it up. Now, these rights generally expire, of course, if the company goes public, and then there's a public market for the shares. In that case or situation, the drag-along rights, you shouldn't force a class of minority shareholder to agree to the sale of the company if it's already gone through an IPO. So anyway, the drag-along rights, in summary, seek to protect the company, and in some cases even protect a preferred class of shareholders, if they're the majority shareholders of the company, from being held up in an intended transaction by a minority group of shareholders.